Hello everyone, and thank you for attending the Launch Bio. Today we're doing Everything is Fine, Clinical Drug Development During a Pandemic. And we are lucky enough here to have Amanda Gentile from Nocion Therapeutics and Aernout van Haarst from Celerion, discussing the new rules of clinical trials, both in and out of the COVID space. But before we begin, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Natasha Eldridge. I am the program director for Launch Bio in Cambridge and Boston. Please excuse the nasally voice. Unfortunately, allergies are all the rage right now. I do want to thank you again for attending. We know you have several webinars that you could attend, so we are honored that you are here attending ours. And just for you guys who don't know, Launch Bio is a nonprofit organization with a mission to build an ecosystem of innovation for the benefit of human health and well-being. We do work in 7 different markets throughout the US and offering educational and networking programs. And now we have moved from in-person to webinars, but we'll see you guys back out there soon. But for more information on our upcoming webinars and registrations, please visit launchbio.org. Tomorrow we are at 1 p.m. Eastern. We do have another program titled Prospective Therapies, Market Challenges, Cutting Edge Medicinal Products. So again, please visit launchbio.org for more information on our upcoming webinars, and you can watch previous webinars as well. And also for more information on our sponsors. And Launch Bio is able to exist with the help of our sponsors like Celerion. And on with the show. So today we are covering what exactly is happening in clinical trials during COVID-19. What are the new regulations imposed by the FDA, and how CROs are also adjusting during this time. First, we will hear from Aernout van Haarst. He's the director of scientific affairs from Celerion, and he has 25 years of drug development experience in biotech companies as well as CROs, including designing drug development strategies through proof of concept, as well as hands-on experience in the design and conduct of early clinical studies in a breadth of therapeutic areas. And he will be followed by Amanda Gentile, who's the VP of Clinical Development at Nocion Therapeutics. Amanda is currently the Vice President of Clinical Development at Nocion, where she works closely with the small but mighty Nocion team to bring their novel charged sodium channel blocker technology into the clinic. So prior to Nocion, Amanda held roles of increasing responsibilities at several Boston area small and mid-sized biotech companies, including the EMA Pharmaceuticals and Efficacy Therapeutics. So please make sure to ask your questions via the Q&A app at the bottom of your screen. We will leave about 15 to 10 minutes to answer questions at the end. So Aernout, you can take it away.
Okay, I hope you're seeing my screen now. Well, thank you, Natasha. So during this seminar on clinical drug development during a pandemic, I want to, let me see how I want to take you through preparing for trial conduct during this COVID-19 pandemic. As you're all familiar with, the numbers of global deaths is increasing every day and has reached over 300 by now. And the virus has been spreading ever since it was found in China globally. And now most severely hitting actually Western countries like Europe and US. And the severity of the disease may be wildly ranging, starting or maybe even passing along asymptomatically in certain patients, but may present rapidly with symptoms like fever and cough and shortness of breath. And in about 7 days after the onset of symptoms, the disease may aggravate and patients may become severely ill, suffering from dyspnea and hypoxemia, and develop all kinds of complications. Now, the measures we have to take care of these patients are limited, apart from supportive care once patients get more severe, they can be hospitalized. But about 30% of hospitalized patients with severe COVID and pneumonia actually require intensive care in the hospital, requiring oxygen supplementation and ventilation. With regard to pharmacological treatments, the only option currently available is remdesivir that has received FDA emergency use authorization in hospitalized patients, but otherwise there are no approved drugs available. So obviously there is a very high unmet medical need. Now, why am I focusing on COVID-19 really if we're developing multiple types of drugs? Maybe that is because COVID-19 underscores the sort of paradoxical situation we're in. Because on the one hand, there's this huge need for new medicines, but on the other hand, the same pandemic has impacted dramatically on the clinical trial conduct. So many trials have been suspended or prematurely concluded, mainly attributed to reasons like safety, patient safety measures, lockdown, social distancing, but also the high demand on medical staff to take care of COVID patients, and that's also illustrated by the number of sites that no longer can be a site for study trials. So amidst this better clinical landscape, how can one still develop a new drug for such an indication? And I think this will set the stage for other drugs that are to be developed in this situation. So for COVID-19, the pandemic, the major authorities have issued guidance to help sponsors and clinics to take care of how to conduct studies. So how to implement measures or maybe adopt some of the procedures to particularly make sure that patients and study subjects are fully safe, because that's the pivotal, of course. And obviously this requires a good balancing of risk and benefit of studies. And certainly for healthy volunteers, the risk may be getting harder and there's no real benefit for them. So this is quite a challenging situation, and authorities have also indicated that priority should be given when enrolling subjects into trials to trials focusing on COVID-19 and related illnesses. So I think that that basically means that whatever we establish for COVID-19 trials will also pave the way for other studies that are to be restarting or initiated. And just to illustrate the commitment of authorities, I quite like this press release recently from the MHRA stating that they managed to approve a COVID vaccine trial within 7 working days. So what trials are actually out there already targeting COVID-19? And there's quite a couple. There's already over 600 trials ongoing targeting COVID-19. And another 600 plus are planned to start in due course. If we look, on the other hand, at the trial phase that these studies are in, it is quite remarkable that many are already in a later stage. So this basically indicates that quite a number of the drugs that are out there are not novel drugs, but are basically repurposed drugs. So either drugs that are already marketed or drugs that are in a later stage development for other indications, but now being repurposed towards treatment of COVID-19. And looking at the types of treatments out there, obviously the majority of targets or drugs is taken by vaccines, prophylactic vaccines, and antiviral drugs. So to prevent and treat the disease, but in addition, there's other treatments like respiratory drugs and drugs boosting the immune system or otherwise modifying immune responses and also to treat COVID-19 related symptoms and complications. So if we look at the types of studies that would be relevant for developing new drugs in this area, on the one hand, there's repurposed drugs, and roughly spoken, these could go straight into COVID patients. The type of patients to be involved in such studies may depend on the mechanism of action, but also on the severity of the disease you want to include. So either mild patients or severe, or even patients in intensive care units. And with regard to innovative drugs, these would usually still need to follow the sort of early type trials, like single ascending and multiple ascending dose studies that would typically involve healthy volunteers. For vaccines and prophylactics, the preliminary efficacy studies will also predominantly be in healthy volunteers, and for other therapeutic treatments, patients may need to be enrolled. And maybe a special category of potential tests to consider is a viral challenge test, which can help in dose range findings, for instance, for antivirals. And typically this would employ RSV or influenza viruses, but as the WHO alluded to earlier this month in a publication, challenges with COVID-19 virus may actually be feasible or conceivable in the future, particularly when numbers of patients are gradually going down as in a couple of months. So anyway, to proceed with these drugs, there's all kinds of fairly standard designs, but that need to be adapted under the circumstances, and not just for healthy volunteers, but certainly for healthy volunteers, safety will be critical, and so there will be additional measures taken. And if we're talking about in exclusion criteria, studies will typically include COVID-19 screenings. But we'll also try to avoid populations at risk, so a smaller age range, people with higher body mass indexes will not be involved, or people with an unfavorable medical history. That, on the other hand, raises the question, like, how do you develop these drugs in special populations like elderly, who are most susceptible to the SARS-CoV-2 virus? In fact, we're currently running a study in elderly residents of long-term care facilities. So there are ways to get around this, but even in our own clinics, specific studies would need specific measures. So, but it is changing the landscape here. To address additional risks is something you need to include also in the benefit risk section of your protocol. Either way, the way to reduce risk in studies is to, one of the ways is to limit the face-to-face visits, or the physical interaction between subjects and staff. So limit the number of site visits, or change to virtual visits. And also safety monitoring may be slightly different, and one really needs to focus on the needs to have rather than what is nice to have in trials. And there may be other measures that are helpful in avoiding any direct contact and reduce the risk of infection. Now, in our Celerion clinics, we've drastically changed the settings to make sure we can conduct studies safely, and so our clinics are open. We have implemented risk mitigation plans to make sure that we screen and isolate the virus if we detect it. And so we have also laid everything down in standard operating procedures that are also very instrumental towards training of staff, which is critical in getting everybody familiar with the new way of working. As obviously social distancing is key, and so we have created segregated spaces and can isolate subjects, and we will have separate study zones. Whoever will visit our clinics, subjects, staff, but also monitors or other visitors, will need to be will undergo temperature monitoring, and also be queried for symptoms for COVID. And our staff and subjects, but I'll allude to the latter later. But our staff will also undergo COVID-19 screening, so we have implemented screens to detect the virus in blood samples, in swabs, and also it is now required to use all kinds of PPEs in our clinics, depending on the events and the studies. But subjects will also be wearing masks and overshoes, as that shoes are particularly a risk of contamination. But for instance, for staff taking swabs, they will be fully dressed up with PPEs to ensure full protection. So it will depend on the specific task and what PPE is being implemented. Also, we have adapted and intensified all our cleaning policies and laundry and biohazard waste handling, etc. And obviously, everyone is recommended to increase frequency of hand washing, and we have disinfection liquids at the entrance of our facilities and also spread throughout the building. And staff training is key, as I alluded to earlier. With regard to healthy volunteers in particular, but subjects in general, we have implemented a 3-tiered screening process to avoid having any infected people in our clinic. So first of all, we will call the subjects and also query them for subjects or symptoms or any recent contacts with patients. Then secondly, they will come to the clinic for a screening visit, where again they will be queried. They will undergo a temperature check and have a COVID-19 PCR test. And then finally, they will again be tested when they are returning for check-in study confinement. So again, queries, temperature check, and PCR test. And during these procedures, obviously PPA will be worn. Now, for patient studies or studies involving external sites, maybe to put it that way, we can't rely on our own internal risk mitigation plan, but risk mitigation plans will be in place for every site. So site-specific ones that need to be reviewed and approved also by the sponsors. Obviously, one needs to consider how COVID-19 patient diagnostic testing can be done. Patients are being involved, but certainly specific situations may be where patients are required to or need to be involved that are in other intensive care treatment. This is quite a complex situation. We do have experience with that, but it is requiring specific attention because informed consent, for instance, requires a legal representative, etc. And regulatory things are quite different around studies like that. Like maybe also for some of the measures that are applicable to our internal clinics may also be implemented in external site studies. So new technologies and other solutions like home nursing visits and maybe follow-up calls and televisits are the type of instrumentum that one may implement in such studies. Monitoring will also be difficult for the next months, if not years. So virtual audits and remote monitoring will need to be relied on, and this may be getting quite complex. But there are various technologies. So like for source data verification in particular, there may be several solutions available. So monitors could get either online access to the data, or they could get a certified copy of the source data, or alternatively, we could organize video calls so the staff could show the monitors the trial data, and we have experience with all those approaches now. Apart from all the impacts on how we operate our trials at the current moment, and the changes we've made, there obviously is a need for a broad variety of tests. I already mentioned the diagnostic tests that are being done routinely in CLIA certified labs in the US, but our labs have also developed various tests, so for instance, to run COVID-19 screens, both PCR and serology testing, to support all the study enrollments and staff testing. In addition to that, to evaluate the effect of drugs, specific tests may need to be implemented or developed and validated. So, for instance, viral loads may need to be assessed if you're developing an antiviral drug. And antibody titers, neutralizing antibody assays, and also cell-mediated immunity methods will be required, for instance, for vaccine studies, or may be required. And if one is developing an anti-inflammatory drug, then obviously inflammatory side effects is very critical for evaluating the drug's effect. So also on our bioanalytical lab side, we've seen quite a couple of changes. Now, I mentioned that this is particularly true all the changes we have implemented for developing COVID-19 studies, but obviously it's not just restricted to those. And somebody asked me the other day, do you think you will have SARS-CoV screenings after the pandemic? And I said, well, you know, there is no after the pandemic. The virus will, the pandemic may wind down, but the virus will be around for the next months, if not years. And things will only gradually return to normal, through new normal. And many of the measures may also still be in place that governments are taking. But certainly some of the procedures that we have implemented will be there to stay. So risk mitigation measures will stay on site. And screening for active infection or even exposure to viral antigens may be in place as well, like we have seen with HIV ever since the 80s, which has become routine in every clinical trial screening. On the other hand, I want to conclude with that, is that there is the pandemic has also generated a opportunity to implement novel technologies and to change the way we work. So to shift to virtual visits, reduce visits, but also implement technologies that can lead to direct data downloads and facilitate research without face-to-face or physical contact. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I thank you for listening and watching. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask or send us a note if you have any drug-specific or project-specific questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Aernout. Let me pull up my screen here. Excellent. Okay, and someone can just let me know. I was having a little bit of trouble hearing everyone else, so hopefully everybody can hear me just fine. So my name is Amanda Gentile. I'm currently Vice President of Clinical Development at Nocion Therapeutics. Thank you, Aernout, for that kind of overview. I'm going to dive a little bit more deeply into some of the operational elements of running not only ongoing clinical trials right now, but also clinical trial startup during the pandemic, whether that be the startup of a trial that is in the COVID space, so something that is designed to treat for COVID, or therapeutic areas that are outside of the COVID-19 area. So we'll start with just very brief overview of the FDA, EMA, and MHRA responses to the COVID-19 pandemic with their various guidance documents and different pathways for submitting studies to them during the pandemic. And then I'll really do a deep dive on the current FDA guidance for management of ongoing clinical trials, and that's ongoing clinical trials regardless of therapeutic area. And then we'll talk about clinical trial startup during the pandemic and how some tricks for getting that done. So this rather chaotic looking schematic is really just to give you kind of a broad strokes view of the timeline for how these three agencies in particular have responded to the pandemic. I do tend to always myself go to the FDA, EMA, and MHRA websites frequently, looking at guidance documents as they are pertinent to a good deal of the work that I do as somebody in the clinical development and operations space. And you can see that it was really in about the mid-March timeframe that all three agencies issued a guidance providing some level of help and support to sponsors for how they should proceed with conduct of clinical trials during the pandemic. And by and large, those three guidances were touching upon really the same elements of patient safety, how to maintain good clinical practice, and how to protect your trial integrity while also needing to make very swift adjustments to your clinical trial practice in order to adjust for the pandemic. So all of the green stars are just highlighting the timeline for the changes to those clinical trial management guidance documents. And then in the purple stars, I've noted specifically for FDA and MHRA, different processes that they have opened up since the beginning of the pandemic that allow sponsors to actually have a little bit more direct and speedy feedback from the FDA and the MHRA with respect to trials that are specifically looking to address the COVID-19 pandemic. And then interestingly, most recently, the FDA over here in the top right corner, this red star here, the FDA actually developed a guidance that gives some very helpful pointers for how to design clinical trials and implement clinical trials that are actually targeting COVID-19. So I'll touch upon that toward the end of the presentation as well. But I think the take home here is that, you know, the regulators are adjusting to this as we make our way through, just like we are. And they have opened themselves up to having more or less, you know, more frequent contact so that they can address our concerns, whether that be for trials that are addressing COVID-19 or trials that are just ongoing and are in other therapeutic areas. So it's something that you should take advantage of and continue to review the guidance documents as they will continue to evolve. Just for your own reference here, I will circulate the slides at the end of this call, and these are just links to the guidances I've highlighted. I did want to point out the EMA guidance on the methodological considerations, which actually focuses on some really great tips for how to manage the back-end pieces of your trial. So maintaining trial integrity in terms of, you know, how you address protocol deviations that are have come up because of COVID-19 and how you, you know, should address statistical analysis related to COVID-19 issues. So very useful guidance there. So now we'll take a deep dive into the current FDA guidance for the management of ongoing clinical trials during the pandemic. And as I said, this is therapy area blind. So this is regardless of any therapeutic area you happen to be working in. Aernout, you know, painted a somewhat bleak picture when he showed us, you know, that there have been hundreds of trials that have been either paused or entirely shut down right now. But this does not mean that everything is canceled. It is possible to move forward. Many of you in the audience are probably moving forward and implementing a lot of the strategies we'll talk about. And FDA's guidance does try to help you make your way through this very challenging time. So the guidance is called Guidance on the Conduct of Clinical Trials of Medicinal Products During the COVID-19 Public Health Emergency. The current version is 11 May, but as I said, I'm sorry, it's actually 14 May. But as I said, it is something that continues to change. The audience is, the typical audience of industry investigators and IRBs. And the three key objectives are to address trial participant safety, maintenance of good clinical practice, and to minimize risks to trial integrity that may occur because of COVID-19 related disruptions to your trial. It should be in effect throughout the duration of the declaration of public health emergency, but I imagine there'll be something on the back end of that public health emergency as well to help us kind of pull things back into the normal sphere. And like all guidances, it's important to note that this guidance is, food for thought, but the specific circumstances of your trial, your participant population and therapeutic area, of course, need to be taken into account in terms of your interpretation of this guidance. So focusing on participant safety, this is, really the primary focus of this guidance from FDA. And of course, the number one thing that they point out is that recruitment may need to be adjusted. You'll need to consider, do you need to halt recruitment? Can you pause recruitment safely and then bring it back up at some other time? And these kinds of safety-related adjustments to your recruitment plan can be made before you implement an amendment per the guidance. And then can you implement a remote consent procedure? There is a actual existing guidance from 2016 from the FDA that outlines the process for remote consent. As Aernout pointed out, it's still a fairly difficult process to implement, so it might not be something you can do on the fly. And then changes to investigational drug administration. This is, of course, another key area with respect to participant safety. Number one is just, is there a logistical issue that's caused by the pandemic? Are your supply chains actually, kind of somewhat cut off or disrupted as a result of the pandemic? And then a risk-benefit analysis should be conducted just like you would at the beginning of a trial. If you do have some major issue with your supply chain, withdrawal of participants from the drug needs to be weighed against the risks. Is there a way for you, is it more risky to withdraw participants from drug administration than it is to find some way to try and keep them on? And of course, you should, to the extent that it's possible, involve the IRB or ethics committee and principal investigators and other site staff in these decisions to help you weigh the risks and benefits to participants with respect to changes in drug administration. And then, as Aernout already pointed out, remote and or virtual safety assessments, essentially, what safety assessments can you move to a more decentralized process? So, for example, are there labs that you can move to the local lab setting versus central so that participants don't have to travel too far to have these safety assessments done? And are there existing decentralized elements of your trial that you can leverage to collect additional data? So for example, home nurses, can you use those nurses to collect safety lab assessments or administer other assessments that were traditionally being collected in the clinic? And then the FDA does, of course, point out that you are most likely going to need to update your protocol design or implementation elements. And in order to allow you a way to do that swiftly without having to go through the traditional rigors of an amendment, they've pointed out that any changes that are there to minimize or eliminate the immediate hazards or to protect the life and well-being of research participants may be implemented without IRB approval or before filing an amendment. So the line there is definitely something you want to really make sure you've fleshed out well. So things that you can implement immediately would include safety-related changes to non-efficacy assessments. So something like moving certain follow-up visits to from in-person to virtual, or reducing the amount of sample collections that are not safety related are things that you could do immediately to help try and reduce SARS-CoV-2 transmission risks without having to go in with a formal amendment right away. But anything that would touch your primary efficacy assessments, especially in later phase trials where efficacy is, of course, of paramount importance, you really, the FDA guidance is to reach out to your review division before making changes that are not immediately required for safety purposes. And then the other thing that we all need to keep in mind is communication and documentation. So, one of the hazards of making changes on the fly like this, especially before we go through the normal process of things like amendments, is that, communication and documentation can kind of fall by the wayside. So it's really important as you're implementing these changes to make sure that not only the study personnel and study team are aware, but that participants are aware of the changes. So you need to have some mechanism for reaching out to your study participants and giving them a sense for the depth and scope of the changes to the trial that are being made. And then document those changes, especially those that you're making before an amendment, because of course, once you make an amendment, you'll have a very good record of what's being done. But prior to that, it's really important to make sure you have some way of capturing the changes that are happening outside of the standard regulatory process. And then you should have a 360 kind of mindset in terms of these changes that you're making. So, based on what you're doing, do you need to potentially update your statistical analysis plan, which is for the most case going to be true for everyone? Is there an EDC update? Are you collecting different data? Are you discarding different data? What changes to your clinical database do you need to make to accommodate this? And then changes to relevant study plans. The other piece, and Aernout touched upon this, is can you create a standalone COVID-19 risk mitigation plan that kind of covers the entire end-to-end elements of how you're mitigating this risk throughout the trial. And then the FDA also, in their guidance, goes into elements of the CSR that they think that ongoing clinical trials should include. So in the clinical study report, you should include these 3 pieces of information to make sure you're fully documenting how you adjusted to the pandemic. So first we had love in the time of cholera, and now we have clinical trial startup in the time of COVID. So moving now from ongoing clinical trials into what it might look like in the startup landscape. And there is no specific FDA guidance relevant to just clinical trial startup right now, but of course we can extrapolate the information that they provided in their ongoing clinical trial guidance, as well as look at the guidance they provided for trials that are starting up in the COVID-19 therapeutic area, and kind of piece those together and use that to help us understand the best way to go about starting up trials right now. So I'm going to focus first on general trial startup, and then I do have a couple slides addressing COVID-19 trial startup specifically at the end here. So key areas, of course, when taking startup under consideration include protocol design. How are you going to adapt the protocol itself to address the pandemic? Patient so participant and clinic and study team safety. So not only how will you keep patients safe, but how are you going to reduce things like nosocomial transmission if you do have in-clinic visits as part of your trial? And then trial integrity, and this includes things like, how do you protect your statistical analysis, and how do you build trial integrity aspects into your study governance plans from the get-go, so that as the pandemic continues to kind of change and shape the way that we do clinical drug development, you have enough flexibility in your governance to adjust to that on the fly. And then, of course, just keeping in mind, you really need to document every step of the process. It's going to be very iterative. Clinical trial startup is already a very iterative process, but perhaps even slightly more so in the pandemic times. So certain aspects of the protocol development process are, probably you're going to include some additional steps that you might not typically include. So most people, I think, already tend to engage regulators and PIs before the protocol is finalized. But in with respect to the pandemic, it's even more important to do that now to make sure you understand what the clinical sites are capable of and what process they already have in place to mitigate COVID-19 risks so that your trial is designed in a way that complements that and that accommodates what is happening on the ground at the various clinical trial centers all over the world. And then consider including an infectious disease expert. So whether or not your trial happens to be in the infectious disease space, that has, because of the pandemic, become an important consideration for all of us. So consider including an expert in infectious disease in the protocol review process. You can invite them to your investigator meeting or your scientific advisory board, for example, as well, just to help provide some comfort to folks to know that you are really considering all of the potential problems brought up by the pandemic. And then, of course, virtual elements should be included in your trial wherever that makes sense. I think this is something that actually the industry has been trying to move toward for many, many years, and where we get stuck is that it's hard sometimes to convince the regulators that new technology is just as good as in-person clinic visits. So, this is just my opinion, but I think now is a good time to really pioneer virtual trial technology to replace in-clinic assessments with at-home, either wearable technology or by decentralized procedures such as home nurses administering drug or taking safety labs. To de-risk your trial as much as possible, you should use validated technology wherever that's possible. And by validated, I just mean technology that has been used in clinical trial settings before and has been shown to actually properly measure the assessment or the measurement principle that you're trying to measure. And keep in mind that data protection and data integrity are still required. So you still need to protect patient data, and you still need to make sure your data is safe and does not go under any alterations when it moves from place to place. So there's still a number of challenges in implementing these types of things, but now is the time to really have those conversations with the regulators to move these types of virtual elements forward. And then in terms of the protocol, I think there are certain sections that you should really make sure to include in your protocol itself to show the regulators and to show your clinical sites that you've fully baked your COVID-19 risk mitigation elements into all aspects of the trial. So without going into too much detail here because of time, I'll just cover the main areas. So including a COVID-19 risk mitigation section of the protocol. So this would just be something that kind of summarizes whatever things you have in your COVID-19 risk mitigation plan to reduce the possibility of on-study transmission. A COVID-19 specific study pause, stopping, or participant withdrawal criteria. So criteria that specifically calls out when the study might be halted or when you might withdraw participants if there are incidents of SARS-CoV-2 infection during the trial. And then a section for, exclusion criteria considerations. So consider excluding participants who've already been infected or those who might be at highest risk for worse COVID-19 outcomes. Aernout touched upon some of this, but this would include patients with a history of diabetes, older patients, obese patients, patients with asthma. And then in your statistical section of your protocol, you should call out how you will treat missing data or disrupted data that has been interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course you would go into more detail about in your statistical analysis plan itself. This is a really key thing that I think, not only for ongoing studies, but for upcoming studies should be included is a COVID-19 risk mitigation plan. This is a separate plan, just like your trial master file plan or your safety management plan or any of the other many governance plans that we look at. And I'm sorry to add another plan to startup, but I think this one is really obviously very necessary given the current pandemic. And this is just a robust way to implement all aspects of COVID-19 risk mitigation across every single aspect of your trial. It's a standalone plan, so you can update it as needed as kind of a living document as we make our way through the pandemic. It'll come in handy during audits. It's something to point to when regulators ask you, how did you adapt to COVID-19? How did you, what was the kind of story of the changes you made to your trial to adjust to the pandemic? It's also a good document to use to help train your entire study team on what the risk mitigation plan is. So at a minimum, I've highlighted here some sections of that risk mitigation plan that I recommend, and these are actually coming straight from a risk mitigation plan that I've recently drafted along with my study team for an early phase study that we'll be conducting. So of course, a background section that just very briefly touches upon the therapeutic area and the phase of work, and references the COVID-specific guidance documents you've taken into account. So reference those guidance documents from FDA or MHRA that you've used so that the regulators know that you've taken those into account. As Aernout mentioned, you should include some information on your screening and recruitment procedures, which I recommend be tiered and start remotely. And then once you've had a number of rounds of SARS-CoV-2 antigen and antibody testing, then you can move forward with actually enrolling the participants in clinic social distancing, which would include not only social distancing for the participants in the study, but also the clinic site staff and how you'll train site staff and participants on those social distancing aspects. And then, of course, use of personal protective equipment, not just for clinic staff, but also for participants as needed. Additional aspects of this COVID-19 risk mitigation plan include, just like we need to do in the community, we need to have testing. Multiple rounds of testing. I recommend at least every 3 days for early phase studies where you have patients in the unit. Of course, in a multi-center later phase trial, that would be difficult to do, but you should include some aspect of ongoing, so not just at screening, but on trial testing for the virus during the study. And then procedures for how you will address incidence rates of infection during the study. Will you sequester the participants? Will you withdraw them immediately? Who will make those decisions, and how will they be made, and when will they be made? And then, of course, considerations for special study assessments. So do you have assessments that require close contact between the study staff and the participant, and how will you mitigate risk in collection of those assessments during the pandemic? Other important things to keep in mind during startup, so liability. We all are very familiar with the process of getting trial insurance certification and trial insurance coverage for your trial ahead of a study, but keep in mind that ethics committees and IRBs are now looking specifically to ensure that participants are covered in the event that they develop the infection while on study, so something to consider. Timelines are, of course, going to likely be a little bit pushed out because it's going to take longer to implement these sorts of things during startup, so take that into account. And then in feasibility, selection, and activation, consider what the anticipated infection rates and what the current regulatory operations are in the regions and at the clinic centers that you plan to work at. So for example, New Zealand, Australia, Germany are kind of on the tail down right now with respect to the infection rate. So these might be better places to start trials than in others. The FDA is continuing. They've stated explicitly they continue to look at non-COVID work, and U.S. centers continue to operate. So again, potentially another good place to consider. But this will continue to change, so you'll have to continue to evaluate the regional landscape as the pandemic continues. And then a data safety monitoring committee. These are not elements of every single trial. Usually this is something you add a little bit later, but some of the guidance documents make it very clear that DSMCs should be included in all new trials at this stage because they can help to make decisions during the study about the safety of participants, specifically with respect to COVID-19. So just to graze the surface on the guidance documents that the FDA has recently put out on startup of work that is specific to COVID-19. So this is work in the COVID-19 therapeutic area. The FDA has issued a guidance that is really quite handy, especially for earlier phase trials, which was something that was kind of lacking before. As Aernout mentioned, there were a lot of trials for drugs that have are being repurposed or in later phases that have kind of made their path through in the COVID-19 space a little faster. And this guidance document really focuses in on the earlier phase trials. So in this guidance, the FDA clarifies that your COVID-19 population that you're including should be well defined and really err on the side of inclusion. Generally, we tend to kind of sterilize our study populations a bit, but in this case, the FDA wants you to be more versus less inclusive. And they do include in the appendix of this document a very good outline of what they mean by a inclusive COVID-19 population. In terms of study design, they're really looking for the gold standard here. So they want you to run randomized controlled trials. So you need to have a placebo arm with a very standard superiority design and maintenance of background standard of care in all arms. And again, that's a little bit tricky because, of course, standard of care for COVID-19 is a little bit of a moving target, but that is what the guidance specifies. And they do state you should limit in-person data collection to just safety and primary efficacy. So again, some wiggle room there to really start spearheading virtual trial elements. The guidance does point out that DSMC should be included to use as a gateway for making key trial continuation decisions. And then lastly, they actually provide some very nice specific guidance for the types of efficacy outcome measures and subsequent endpoints that you should consider in these trials. Not surprisingly, all-cause mortality is at the top of the list. And then they kind of move down from there into the less severe outcomes. Importantly, they point out virologic endpoints, so things like viral load, are acceptable in the phase 2 setting as a primary endpoint. But in phase 3, they don't find these to be appropriate because there's really no predictive power to the size or temporal relationship between viral reduction and outcomes in patients in the COVID-19 space. So with that, I'll leave it there, and I think we're moving now to questions.
Yes, so we have a couple minutes for questions. I know that we went over a little bit, but I think this is extremely important information. So I'm happy that we actually went over. I do have a couple questions that came in from registration. So I will start there from Shari. What type of testing, i.e. antibody, will be done in staff and with what frequency? Will these data be part of any research database? So in terms of I believe, the CRO.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a good question. I think I did allude to how we will be testing our both subjects and staff, and staff will be tested every couple of weeks, or if needed, more frequent, of course, if there's any indication of symptoms or anything like that. But basically, I think every 30 days they will be tested, at least. And we do routinely do, I'm not sure if that was part of the question, but we do standardly do PCR testing, so really to screen for the virus, not so much the antibodies against it.
Okay. Yeah, and in terms of your, sorry, the question about will that be part of a database, I think it really depends on the type of trial, right? So for trials that are not focused on COVID-19 as a therapeutic area, I would say that data likely won't be captured as part of the clinical data set, but certainly for COVID-19 related therapeutic areas, that might be something you'd want to capture.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think if it's about testing in staff, then we will not use that for any database. It's really the subject testing will be stored, but not the staff testing.
Okay, and another question we have here is from Corbin Crew. He says, when implementing a DSMC, are there any particular professionals that allow this to be done smoothly in smaller teams with limited budgets?
So in terms of assembling a DSMC.
Implementing, assembling, that's what they wrote. So.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I've always worked in small companies and have relied very heavily on my CRO team to help me assemble and implement and administer the DSMC. So essentially looked to my CRO team to not only develop the charter, which of course, you know, I had a heavy hand in oversight and finalization, but they, you know, developed our charter and also did outreach to individuals that they felt would be good members of that DSMC. So I would say if you're in a smaller setting with limited resources, reach out to your CRO, give them a sense for what you're looking for, and they can kind of take the reins there.
Okay, and here I have another question from Arvind. Briefly, to what extent do the guidances on general trial practice by EMA and MHRA parallel what the FDA has out now?
They're very, very similar. And so part of the reason I brought up that schematic was to kind of show, you can see they're all lined up temporally very close together, and there's a reason for that. It's because they tend to echo one another. So I haven't seen any major differences between what the FDA, MHRA, or EMA are saying with respect to how you adapt your ongoing clinical trials to the pandemic. I would say that EMA does seem to have in their methodological considerations guidance a little bit more of a leg up on how to handle some of the back end issues. So things for, you know, like statistical considerations in particular and treatment of protocol deviations that seems a little bit more robust so far than FDA or MHRA.
Okay, and we will end on one last question, and this was also written in from Sheila. How receptive is FDA to discussing, let's say, the use of an Apple Watch for remote monitoring of some kind? Aside from how far FDA is willing to go, how far into innovation are sponsors willing to try to go?
So maybe I'll take that one first because I had a little mention of that in my slide. So I think, you know, in terms of sponsors being willing, I think traditionally sponsors have been a little bit wary of some virtual trial elements like a wearable biometric device, right? Because we usually wait until somebody else validates that tool robustly and gets all the way through, you know, a drug approval before we feel comfortable implementing that sort of thing ourselves. I think given the pandemic, you're going to see more sponsors willing to kind of dive into the deep end of the pool a little bit more on that. And in terms of, you know, is FDA willing to have those conversations? I think yes. I think in their guidance, they actually say, you know, they are, you know, they want to see you implement measures that do not require in-person data collection, and that certainly an Apple wearable device would fall under that category. So I think, you know, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but certainly now is the time to try and pioneer that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think many of the technologies are in place, are already accepted, and it is indeed, like you say, recommended by FDA. So I don't think they specifically recommend Apple Watches, but I guess there would be good grounds to start exploring that too. Absolutely.
Okay, and on that note, we are ending our webinar for today. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Aernout, for hosting this with us. I think, again, it's really important information that the audience needs to know. If you are interested in their slides, please contact me and I will get you over to the proper channels so you can get a copy of the slides. And on that note, again, we have another webinar tomorrow, so hopefully we will see you guys again tomorrow. And I thank you. Thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. So thank you. Bye.